Hello, puppies and kittens. I am with Dr. John Andrew Morrow, and we're going to be talking about a famous verse in the Quran, one that has been used for, to advocate or to say that the Quran advocates spousal abuse. Now, there's Surah 4:34. I'm going to read that now. Men are the caretakers of women, as men have been provisioned by Allah over women and tasked with supporting them financially. All righteous women are devoutly obedient and, when alone, protective of what Allah has entrusted them with. And if you sense ill conduct from your women, advise them first. If they persist, do not share their beds. If they still persist, then discipline them gently. But if they change their ways, do not be unjust to them. Surely Allah is most high, all great. Now, there do seem to be some variance in the different translations. Is that right?
Absolutely. And in my book, the most controversial Quranic verse, why 434 does not promote violence against women, and I'd like to comment upon that title. So this book was originally titled "And Beat Them," the most controversial Quranic verse. Now, the publisher came back to me and said, we need to change the title. The people in marketing won't have it because it intimates that the Quran promotes domestic violence. And if that appears on the title, university libraries, public libraries will not purchase the book. They will view it as Islamophobic, right? And so they insisted on this subtitle, why 434 does not promote violence against women. All right.
Okay, now, it does say in other translations to beat them, but says to beat them gently.
All right. Now, the gently, of course, is not there in the Arabic. There's no disputing the fact that it says, and beat them. You can translate it as, and beat them, and strike them, and hit them. The Quran says, idribuhunna, from the verb daraba, the main meaning of which is to hit, to beat, or to strike. However, in all linguistic and academic honesty, the verb does have 60 different meanings. All right? So, it means, daraba also means leave them, separate from them. It can also mean have sex with them. It could mean stop them, hinder them, express your indignation to them, avoid them, turn away from them, ignore them, forsake them, cover them, and so on. We could go on and on and on. Okay.
I'm sure you could, as we mentioned before we started recording, that your degree is in languages and literature.
Yes.
And you also have a solid background specifically in Islamic studies. Yes? Can you explain that just for a moment?
Sure. So my areas of expertise include Hispanic studies, Islamic studies, and indigenous studies. So I studied literature at the undergraduate and graduate level at the University of Toronto. So as I was studying literature, languages, culture, civilization, and all of that, I studied Islamic studies, indigenous studies, and Hispanic studies. I also completed over 40 years of traditional Islamic seminary studies under the direction and guidance of traditionally trained Sunni, Shiite, and Sufi ulama. And so when I approach any topic, I approach it using traditional methodology, but also critical, historical, Western methodology as well. And so we were talking about the title, which originally was "and beat them," which is literally what the Quran says. Okay, so it's very dishonest for a person to say that it does not encourage domestic violence. All right. Now, there are many different translations, and in my book, I give dozens and dozens and dozens. I went through every available translation, English translation of that verse 434, and I give all the different variants and so on. But it's basically men have power over women because God has made one stronger than the other. Righteous women are obedient and they protect what they're supposed to protect. If you fear that they will be disobedient, admonish them. So basically scold them. Some people say refuse to share their beds. It's like banish them to their beds. Or some people have like confined them to their bedrooms, lock them to their bedrooms. And according to some interpretations as well, it's actually tie them to their beds. And then finally, the third strike is idribuhuna, or beat them. Okay?
Now, even if we don't have the beat them in there, this is abusive.
Absolutely. And some people will tell you, and there is maybe one classical exegete who said that idribuhuna means have sex with them. And sometimes you'll have some Islamist feminists say, no. It doesn't say beat them. It says have sex with them. So you scold your wife, you send her to her bed, or you tie her to the bed, and then you have sex with her. And I'm sorry, your interpretation is even worse, okay? What's worse? To get a slap or to actually, marital rape. It is very violent. Okay, so we can't deny that. But also, we can't deny that the verb has many, many other meanings, and that potentially it could be interpreted differently. So there's a rabbi who wrote a book called Dangerous Religious Ideas. And she addresses these dangerous religious ideas that are found in the Bible, that are found in the Quran, and so on, and how some scholars have tried to tone things down because they came across these verses and they said, whoa, wait a second here. What are the potential consequences of this verse? And so they try to tone things down. And so just like we can't deny that, yes, it could be separate from them. It could be divorce them. Okay, sure. Linguistically speaking, maybe. But then you have to go and examine the exegetical tradition. How has this verse been interpreted over the course of the past 1400 years? Did these scholars actually believe that it meant separate from them, draw them closer to you? Well, I went through every single tafsir or commentary of the Quran, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them over the past 1,000 years in this book, and I examined their interpretations. And the overwhelming consensus of all of the exegetes was it means beat them, strike them, and hit them. So that's the tafsir tradition. Then you also have the field of fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence. And you can go and see, okay, well, how did the jurists interpret this? So the jurists are relying on the Quran, but also on the Hadith literature in order to derive rulings and laws for society. And you find once again that the consensus of those scholars was that husbands do have a right to strike their wives. Now, many of them argued that it had to be ghair mubarih, right?
I don't know Arabic, so
which means it's not. That means not severe. And so, in that translation that you provided, they put gently, but that's not what it says. It says not severe. And then you have to go and see what is their definition of a beating that is not severe. And yeah, and if you look at that, it is actually quite startling.
Well, I'm all ears.
Yes, I just needed a bit of water. So,
because I mean, what you're saying, your book is that it does not promote spousal abuse, but the woman will be kept as a pet. Basically, she is subservient. She is obedient. She does what you tell her. She doesn't have an opinion. She doesn't have any. She's not an equal in any sense.
Yes. Now, of course, that subtitle was not a subtitle of my choice. It was selected for purposes of marketing. It is possible to come up with different interpretations of this verse. And this is what many modern Muslims have done, especially starting in the 20th century, but mostly in the 21st century. There was a translator, the late Layla Bakhtiar, who translated, she was the first American to translate the Quran into English. So she started translating. She did chapter 1, 2, 3. She's translating chapter 4. She hits 434. And when she reached that point, she says, if this is what the Quran says, I stop here. I will not continue my translation. Okay? And this is this many Muslims can relate to that experience, right? When they read the Quran and so on, and they come across a verse like this, it's very unsettling. And so Layla Bakhtiar said, well, it can't mean that. And so she started to conduct a research and so on. And she found that in Arabic, it has 60 different meanings. And she selected, I believe, that, separate from them. And so if you have problems with your wife, you talk to her, you admonish her. If you feel that she's, rebellious or she's going to be unfaithful or God knows what. But it's not just that. Because if you read the commentaries of the Quran, it's not just your wife is cheating on you. And again, it doesn't say she's cheating on you. It doesn't say she's rebellious. It says if you fear that she will be rebellious. This is a preemptive strike. Okay,
well,
so
this is also very vague. I mean, we're just talking about a simple disagreement, right? I tell somebody, I say, please don't buy anything more on Amazon without telling me first. Yeah, and then there's another package every day. That's what they could be talking about, right?
Sure. No, absolutely. And if you look at, for every single word in that verse, I could speak probably for an hour. And scholars have written articles about this and so on. So there's the issue of what does daraba mean? What does nushuz or disobedience mean? What does that ghair mubarih or not severe mean? But that's not from the Quran. That's from a hadith. And what is disobedience? What does it entail? Is it she's gonna cheat on you? No, it's just simple things like you mentioned. If you look in the books of law and in the books of exegesis, it is tiny little mundane things that you are within your right to physically discipline your wife in the same fashion that it is your right to use corporal punishment on children. So let's just look at this ghair mubarih thing. And this actually appears.
So we are infanticizing women. I mean, women are subservients. They are pets. They are property.
They are minors for life. So a woman, when she's a minor, before she's married, she's under the authority of her father. When she gets married, she passes to be under the authority of her husband. And if her husband would pass away, she goes back to the authority of her father or her uncle. She needs to have a wakil or a representative. It is profoundly patriarchal, but this is not something that's exclusive to Islam, nor, the issue of domestic violence. If we're talking about domestic violence, this is something that we find in most cultures. In terms of just legal codes, it goes back thousands of years to Roman law. It was enshrined in law that a man has a right to strike his wife, to beat his wife. That's Roman law. And then Christianity comes along, and they continued with that. It's only in the 20th century, okay? So we start having laws against domestic violence in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century. But it's mostly in the 20th century. And I've actually met some of the women who were instrumental in getting these laws passed. That's how recent it is in Western history. They're in their 70s now, but these are feminist activists from the 60s and 70s who pressured, the government to pass laws because, there was something known as the rule of thumb, that you could beat your wife, but it couldn't be bigger than, and that's the whole miswhack that
we have to jump into that a little bit deeper because
Yeah.
this is a personal, this pet peeve of mine.
Yeah.
Is if they want to use the term, well, the rule of thumb is and no, that's not the rule. That's the rule,
right,
in this case, in this context, but it's not the rule of thumb. There's only one rule of thumb. The one and only rule of thumb was that you could only use a rod as thick as your thumb to beat your wife. That's the rule of thumb. There is no other rule of thumb. If we're talking about anything other than spousal abuse, then we are not talking about the rule of thumb. It's just something that bothers me. I hear rule of thumb brought up so much by people who have no idea what it means.
Absolutely.
It's like when you hear people say, well, I could care less. Well, okay, well, that means that you care a little bit. But nobody gets that either.
Yeah. And so there are some, according to some jurists, you're allowed to strike your wife with a miswhack. And a miswhack is like a toothstick, a toothbrush. It's a type of plant. And it's like a whip. So it's the same thing as rule of thumb, that you could hit her, but you can't hit her with a 2x4. You can hit her with, this plant. I mean, that's worse than slapping someone. It's going to leave marks. It's bad. But I want to get back to this whole thing.
That's giving me flashbacks to my childhood when my great grandmother would send me out as a 5 to 8 year old boy. She would send me out to fetch a switch. Now I'm supposed to get a green branch. It has to be green so that it's flexible, and I have to strip the bark off and I have to strip the side leaves off, and then I have to test it so that it makes a whoop noise when I whip it through the air.
Oh my.
Yeah, and then I can bring it to her, and then she'll pull my pants down and whip me across the back of my thighs. Mm-hmm. For what? For being insubordinate, for being disobedient, for the same thing that this verse is talking about.
Exactly. So now this thing about gently or not severe appears in in Muhammad's final sermon. If you had to pick a final message, okay, why would that be one of your final? I mean, he says several things, but in it, well, allegedly he says, allegedly, because we need to remember that this literature, the Hadith literature, dates from about 300 years after the Prophet. So as a historian, from a scholarly point of view, we can't say for sure. No, it's like 99.9%, almost 100% certain he never said any of these things. These are just legal opinions and sayings that are back projected to him. Okay, 300 years through the oral tradition and the scribal tradition. But it doesn't appear.
I need to bring up something else
too.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no. Go ahead.
One of the other issues that I have is when we look at the Quran as Americans, and mm-hmm. being typically raised Christian and all that, want to feign superiority over this other culture is often the case. But I remember in my lifetime, I'm in my 60s now. I remember in my lifetime, it was socially acceptable to bend your wife over your knee and spank her.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure.
In American culture. So don't get too high and mighty over what you think this verse means.
Yes. No, for sure. So there are different versions of that final sermon. And this thing about, Okay, you have the right to strike your women, but only ghair mubarih, only in a non-severe fashion. That, yes, that does appear in some versions of that sermon, but in the oldest version that we have that survives to date, it's not there. Which from a textual, critical point of view, it seems to have been interpolated or added at some point. But in any event,
just to cover that again, to stress that, you're saying that the oldest
version of that final sermon that we have that exists does not mention that. Actually,
so it doesn't appear until you said something like 300 years after the prophet.
Well, the Hadith literature itself. Now, the Hadith literature appears about 300 years after the Prophet. That's when it was written down. Among the Shia, some of their books were only compiled 1,000 years after the passing of the Prophet. Okay?
I need to clarify this again, too. So for anybody who's not familiar with the Quran, they're not going to know what the Hadiths are. And I'm going to be very uncharitable in my description of them.
Sure.
The Hadiths are untold thousands of commentaries written by anybody, any random Joe who says, well, what God meant here was this.
Well, that would be the tafsir, which is the exegetical tradition. So interpretation, commentary, that's tafsir. But hadith are the sayings attributed to Muhammad. And then there's the sunnah,
which are there?
His actions. Millions upon millions. And well, there you go.
Is there any realistic way to expect that? I mean, because nobody can put a definite number on it. Earlier in this conversation, you yourself said hundreds and hundreds, and now you're saying millions and millions. So, can anybody write a hadith?
Well, the hadith, these sayings were, I don't know, kind of like the social media of the period, and any random person can attribute something to the Prophet. Right? If you were selling tomatoes, you can say, the Prophet said tomatoes are delicious, eat tomatoes, and you can use that in your marketing. And we have cases of that clearly they're being written by people who are selling zucchinis and God knows what, the blessings of the zucchini and this and that. So yes, and there were so many different currents, competing currents. People with different agendas, political agendas, economic agendas, theological, social. So of course, these sayings attributed to the Prophet were fabricated in astronomical numbers.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, how much? I know that there are people who study the Quran without acknowledging hadiths at all.
Yes, the Quranist would do that. Yeah, and the Mu'tazila, a rationalist school of thought that was persecuted out of existence, they also were highly suspicious of that hadith literature and tried to rely on the Quran and reason. All right, and among the Shia also, there's a strong tradition of relying on reason, to not blindly follow these texts. You can imagine how dangerous it is to just blindly follow these things. For example, you gave that lecture on the morality or immorality of murder during that cruise, which I thought was fantastic. But can you imagine if people literally try to follow all these verses about who you should kill that are found in the Old Testament, right? It's the same thing with Islam or other religions. I mean, you have to step back and use your brain and so on. But
I wish Christians would realize that somewhere in their texts, and it's not even in the Christian text, it's in the Hebrew Bible, that talks about, that if one of your family members, even your own brother, wants to move to a different religion, suggests that you should convert to a different religion, that it is your obligation to murder your brother.
Yes. And we have that in Islam as well. Irtidad, apostasy, the killing of the murtad. If you want to kill anyone in the Muslim community, you just accuse them of being an apostate, and that's your excuse right there. Again. So getting back to this whole thing of non-severe or gently. Now, I mean, some people are going to tell me, oh, he's not citing references and so on. So Tabari ibn Abbas, Ata, Qatada, Samarkandi, Wahidi, Baghawi, Tabarsi, Qurtubi, Baydawi, Bikai, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So there are dozens and dozens of scholars who said that you can beat your wife, but gently. Okay. But let us look at how they defined a non-severe beating. So we have Qurtubi here who says, the beating in this verse is a beating that is not severe, one that does not break bones. So his definition of a non-severe beating is you can beat her to a pulp, you can beat her black and blue, so long as you don't break bones, this is a legal beating. And if this woman goes to court and complains about it, there are no charges that will be pressed against this man. Others,
in Sharia.
Yes, according to Sharia law. Yes. Yeah. So no broken bones.
This is still sounding an awful lot like it promotes abuse. I know the title of your book says otherwise, but
yes. Well, sure. Well, no, of course, this isn't in the Quran. This is in Sharia law. Others, define a non-severe beating as one that isn't bloody. And so you can leave bruises and so on. And they get into like the color of the bruises and so on, right? They distinguish between this. And as long as you don't, break skin, as long as there's no blood, I mean, they all agreed you can't hit a woman on the face. And so they say you have to distribute the blows throughout the body because you're not allowed to hit her in the face. But that gives you an idea. That gives you an idea. I mean, I could go on and on. There's a whole chapter there about, and you'll say, well, Dr. Morrow, these are people who lived in the 10th century and so on. And well, let me give you an example of a 20th century scholar, very, very well respected, Abdul Majid Daryabadabi, who died in 1977. And this is what he says. Beating is not at all so incompatible with law inconsiderateness. And he goes on to give all kinds of examples of how Mexico and people of lower class and culture, they beat their wives and so on. And flogging, beating, and whipping have been practiced as punishment by everyone in the world since the dawn of history, both among the civilized and the savage. England was at one time the classic land of flagellation. When you go to a woman, forget not your whip. And he goes on about Slavic countries and so on. And so he just goes on and goes on and goes on, justifying, the most brutal abuse of women. So we still have these people to this day who are defending, like, you had that, perfect dawa guy or, imperfect dawa who was arguing that, no, it doesn't mean beat them. No, it does mean beat them. There are other ways that you can interpret it, and you should interpret it differently, okay? So, I mean, people have two options. Either they can leave the religion, or they could reinterpret the religion. And when you're dealing with women who are already in a very oppressive situation from which they cannot escape, intact or alive, maybe it's better to give them tools to reinterpret their tradition so that they can fight back. I mean, do you fight them from the outside or do you fight them from the inside? And so, I mean, ultimately, it's a choice that a human being has to make. But, I mean, it's like the issue of slavery. We have scholars to this day who insist that, not only is slavery permissible in Islam, and we can have a whole session just on that topic. I wrote a book on it, Islam and slavery, who believe that slavery and, concubinage, sexual slavery, is perfectly permissible in Islam, and that should be revived. Okay, we have Western academics, converts to Islam, white people, black people, who claim that this is the case. And they get very emotional and defensive if you call into question whether this is really acceptable from an ethical point of view, right? They think they're being very, very faithful to the tradition. So you have people who are defending slavery and concubinage, and you have people who continue to defend domestic violence. And this we
And
see.
this comes also from Christians, not just converts to Islam.
Right.
I've seen Christian Republican senators
Yeah.
arguing in defense of the reinstatement of slavery and of depriving women of the vote and all of this. And it is the case that if you go back 100 years in American culture, it was the accepted norm that you would respond to a disagreement by punching someone in the nose. That was common.
Yeah, the French slapping with the glove and so on. Yeah, it was socially acceptable. So yeah, there you have it.
Right. So I'm getting the impression that they gave you the wrong title to your book.
Yes, they did. They were also concerned about the repercussions of just titling it "And Beat Them," the most controversial Quranic verse. They were concerned about the repercussions they might face, the blowback from Islamists, but also from nation states, and so on. So they had legitimate concerns. But wait a second here. Where do we live? Do we live in Iran? Are we under the Taliban? Why is it that independent academic presses have to live in fear of radical Islamic fundamentalists? All right.
Well, I don't know. I don't think that's the issue.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I've been with a number of ex-Islamic apostates. A couple of them have spoken on the idea that Islamophobia is an irrational fear of Islam, and one speaker in particular said that my fear of Islam is not irrational; it's well-founded. So there's that way to address it. In the marketplace of ideas, we need to be able to criticize.
Absolutely.
Any idea on its merit or lack thereof. But there are some people who think that if you make a blanket statement, and this is fair, that if you make a blanket statement that you're going to be overgeneralizing and that this would be unfair to large swaths of people, and I get that. But you still have to be able to make reasoned arguments on specifics.
Oh, absolutely.
And I've been many times accused that by people who think that if they have put you into one of their little boxes, if they've applied one of their little labels to you, that means all of these other labels apply too.
Right.
And so they tell me, well, that I've identified you as a leftist, and that means that you're afraid of criticizing Islam. Dude, I spent 3.5 years reading the Quran as an infidel, blaspheming the Quran. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, you did that here, but you wouldn't go over there and do it. Where's over there? I've been to a couple of Sharia countries, and yes, I've spoken out and gotten in trouble over it. I once had to be rushed out of a public venue because I was told that what you just said, which would be completely harmless in a free country where you have freedom of speech, is a 4-year felony here. We have to get you out of here.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I'm all for criticizing the ideas on specifics, not making the blanket prejudice, though.
No,
there's a subtle distinction there.
Yes. So, if we look at the consequences of this verse and the teachings and the philosophy behind it, in the book on chapter 1, I provide statistics of domestic violence. And we find that in a country like Pakistan, according to numerous studies, these are scholarly studies, some of them are government studies, some of them are Amnesty International, the World Health Organization, Human Rights Watch, and so on. In Pakistan, up to 99% of women report being victims of domestic violence. Another study, it was 90%. Another one was between 70 and 90, and then yet another one was 80%. Why are there differences? It's because their definition of domestic violence may be different. And in my book, it's really bare bones. To me, domestic violence is when you put your hand on a woman. Okay, some people will say, if you yell at a woman, that's a form of domestic violence. No, let's just keep it really basic. And so here in this book, I focus on actual corporal punishment, striking women, as high as 99% in Pakistan. Afghanistan, 87%, according to one study, 85%. In Turkey, it's about 42%. That's a government study. They acknowledge that they have a problem. Okay, that's the first thing that you have to do. We're not bashing people. We're not stereotyping and so on. We're just saying we have a problem. In America, the average, the average white woman 20% of them report being battered. So in the white community, it's about 20% domestic violence. In the African-American community, it's about 40% domestic violence. And in the indigenous community, it's about 80%. Okay, so these are just statistics. There's nothing racist about it. There are issues. There are reasons for these rates, and we have to address these issues. But not all Muslims batter their wives. Okay, so there are many factors involved. There is religion, social class, education, culture, all of that stuff. But religion is one of the factors. In Bosnia, domestic violence is 23%. In Jordan, these are Arabs, it's 20%. In the Maldives, it's 17%. In Azerbaijan, 12%. The rate of domestic violence in Albania is 8.2%. Now, Morocco is a 99.9% Muslim country. The rate of domestic violence is 6.4%. So when I criticize domestic violence and wife beaters and so on, I'm not generalizing, right? I'm not painting all Muslims with the same brush at all, okay? Because, the Moroccans are Muslims, they're Arabs, they're Berbers, and most of them do not beat their wives. So,
for a similar challenge, select any Christian that you don't like and see how that person compares to every other Christian.
Yes.
If you take any one Christian and try to use them as an example of all Christians, you're going to find that nobody matches that guy.
For sure. So I want to go back to another issue, about the Republicans and the Christians and so on, and finding excuses for domestic violence. I'm a social worker. This is one of the things that I do. And in our field, we find, and I deal with domestic violence and batterers and victims and so on. Okay. The most common excuse that we hear from white Christian men is that she won't submit. They refer to that verse in the New Testament that wives submit to your husbands. She won't submit. The first thing they use overwhelmingly is a religious justification. So it's like religious patriarchy. And when we deal with Muslim clients, they will refer to 434. They will say, it's my right. Now, I was trained by Muslim scholars. I was basically raised by Muslim scholars. I was in their homes. I was in their offices when they were counseling people. And time and again, women would come in and say, "Ya Imam, Ya Sheikh, Ya Maulana, my husband beats me." And what would they say? "Well, sister, it's his right." Whew. It's his right. Or, "What did you do to provoke him?" Hello.
Blame the victim.
There you go. Now, another interesting thing that I found, okay, when, trying to find answers. Okay, so we have all of these different rates. 99% domestic abuse in Pakistan, 6.4% in Morocco, 38% in Iran, 35% in Somalia, 33% in Egypt, and so on. I wanted to figure out, okay, why? What is the constant there? So, there are predictors for domestic violence. That could include race, culture, ethnicity, and nationality, patriarchy, gender inequality, social status, lack of civil rights, poverty, armed conflict, weak sanctions. But I found something very interesting. support for Sharia law. So in Pakistan, we have a 99%, okay, let's be fair, it's from 70 to 99% domestic violence rate. 85% of Pakistanis are in favor of Sharia law. Aha. In Afghanistan, we have 85 to 87% domestic violence rates. According to studies there, 99% of the people in Afghanistan support Sharia law. They want to live under Sharia law. And so when I went through all of these different countries, I found a very clear correlation between religious fundamentalism and domestic violence. And we find that here in the United States as well.
Yep.
Right?
I've seen plenty of statistics that show that the more devoutly or the more extremely religious an abuser is, the more abusive they are with more and younger victims.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And is this because it's all based on authority?
Yeah. Yeah. It's religiously justified, domestic violence rooted in patriarchy. So yeah, there are consequences to these texts, and there are consequences, real consequences to women, when it comes to the interpretations. You'll find that throughout the Muslim world, by and large, there are no laws prohibiting domestic violence. And it's always the religious argument. Yeah, it's always the religious argument.
Yeah. So no surprises there, from my perspective.
No, it's true. But and the other thing is,
I fully expected that, given the title of your book,
yeah,
that you were going to convince me that verse didn't really say what I always thought that it said. And when you talk about the different translations, when I read the Quran, I had to read 6 different translations and compare them for every verse throughout the entire thing, because they're many of them can be dramatically different. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them make references to things that aren't really in the Quran, that are just part of Muslim tradition. And so I had to then visit my interpretation of that to a panel of Arabic-speaking Muslim apostates and a couple of believing Muslims on occasion, to explain what I got right or wrong. So it's a lot harder to read the Quran from the Western perspective. I think the only way I could compare it is if you're going to read the Bible. If you grew up in Punjab, India, and you'd never met a Christian, then if you read the Bible, you're never going to know that the serpent in the garden is supposed to be Satan, mm-hmm. and you're never going to know that Jesus is supposed to be his own father.
Right. And so, yes, it can, and it does mean beat them. However, it's possible because there are so many different definitions to the verb daraba, it could be interpreted differently. And so in the book, this is what I do. I interpret the verse by the verse, and I go into the different meanings of it and how it could be read. I interpret the verse in light of directly related verses. So I compare it to other verses about women and how they should be treated with love and everything. And I do what Muslim scholars try to do, is reconcile them, right? Harmonize them in some way. Well, because that's a contradiction. And they recognize that there are contradictions in the Quran, and scholars try to reconcile them. So I interpret the verse in light of the Quran as a whole. And so if you look at all the ethical teachings and everything, can we reconcile this verse with the rest of the book? Well, maybe we need to tweak that interpretation. Now, there are many traditions attributed to Muhammad, and as I've made very clear, I don't believe any of these are authentic. There are many traditions that prohibit domestic violence. Okay? So there are sayings of Muhammad, excuse me, in which he prohibits domestic violence.
Yeah, if you want to punish a disobedient wife, take away her dolls.
Right.
Or don't let her go to second grade that day.
Oh, and also that final sermon, okay, that says, beat them, but beat them gently. There is another version of that sermon in which he specifically tells his followers, La tadribuhunna, do not beat them. So, what did he actually say? If that's, let's say he said, La tadribuhunna, do not beat them. Was the la or the no, was the don't, because the Quran says beat them. Was there a don't beat them at the end of that thing? Talk to them, send them to the room, right? And don't beat them. So is it the Quran that was changed or the Hadith? So, but you can clearly see that people are manipulating the sources. And so there are many traditions in which the Prophet says clearly you cannot put your hands on a woman. But then there's another body that's just as big that says, yes, you can beat your wife. And some of these traditions are absolutely horrible. Like hang your whip where your wife can see it, right? So there's always this looming threat in the household. You don't even have to hit her. You just look at the whip. It's like, back in the old days when your dad would just grab his belt buckle or so on, right? You knew you were out of line, okay? So it's that threat. Now,
my grade school principal, when I was a little boy, had a what is a badminton paddle?
Yes.
Yes, and had holes drilled in it so that there would be less wind resistance.
Oh no. Yeah, the paddle.
Yeah, so this goes back to what, 1970 roughly, right? When it was legal for the principal of the school to do that to other people's kids. Yes. And I've had it done to me.
Right. There was still a bit of that when I was growing up. My mom and my dad told me all kinds of terrible stories of abuse. So the other thing you can do is you can interpret the verse in its historical context. You can view the Quran as 7th century, Northwestern Arabic literature. So it reflects the time and the place in which it was created. And that maybe it isn't the best idea for us in the 21st century to try to live according to 7th century laws. All right? So there's also the reformist interpretation. You have these reformists who want to clean up all of these laws and so on. They want to live in the modern world. You can interpret the verse in the spirit of Islam as a whole, or as the Sufis did. The Sufis didn't even touch this verse, right? And if they did, they interpreted it allegorically, okay? But it's like you were saying in your lecture on, the morality of murder. When it says kill them, how do you interpret that allegorically? How is that a metaphor? And if someone misinterpreted you and they went and they did it, okay, whose fault is it? Right? So, same kind of thing.
All right. I'm going to let you close up because I think this went well, and I have other topics that I want to discuss with you. Maybe do another show on other things.
Sure.
Pertaining to this, but we'll let you go ahead and close up. Sell what you need to sell. Where can we find you? All of that.
Yes. So if you're interested in learning more about this topic, this very controversial topic, the book is The Most Controversial Quranic Verse. And you could purchase it online. And if it's too expensive, you can, read it. You can acquire a copy, borrow a copy from a library. If they don't have it, talk to the librarian, right? They have acquisitions librarians. And a lot of libraries, public libraries, they're very good at that. Their patrons are able to order books. You can submit a request, and the odds are they will order the book and add it to their collection. So that's another way of accessing this information. So It's open-minded, it's objective, it provides all kinds of ways of reconciling this verse with the rest of the Quran, but ultimately I am concerned about human beings and how they treat one another, and I'm deeply concerned about the rights of women. So I think that's enough for today, and I would love to discuss other topics with you in the future.
I'm sure we will. Thank you very much, Dr. Morrow.
Thank you, sir.